Hi class, this is the third and final apology video. It's on the sentencing, and again there's some important philosophical meat and arguments in there, so that's why I decided to make a third video. Again, slightly different than the syllabus, sorry, I had to finish the syllabus a while ago. What's going on here? So first of all, there are some similarities and differences with U.S. jurisprudence and ancient Athenian jurisprudence. First of all, in the U.S., in a criminal trial, the jury has to be unanimous. In Athenian, it's just a majority. And part of the reason for that is these juries were enormous, 300 to 500 people. You can't get 300 to 500 people to agree on anything. You can't get 500 people to agree that the world is round. So, majority is all that is needed. They voted, and they found Socrates guilty. But it was a very close margin, closer than Socrates thought it would be anyway, so he persuaded some. Now here's the other different part between U.S. jurisprudence and ancient Athenian. In the U.S., the judge hands out the sentencing after the jury has determined guilt. In ancient Athens, instead, the prosecutor would suggest a sentence, the defense would suggest a sentence, and then the jury voted on that again. There was no judge. So, Melitus suggests death. Now, I don't know for sure, and this is speculation to a degree, but just because Melitus did this, you can't infer Melitus actually wanted Socrates to die. That is not a good inference. Why? It's bargaining. It's a negotiation. If you want to get $500, you don't ask for $500. You ask for $1,000. So, in this case, if you want Socrates to get a serious punishment, you suggest the most serious one possible to make sure that Socrates suggests something of appropriate seriousness as well. So don't infer just because Melitus said this, he necessarily wanted Socrates to die. So, then comes Socrates' turn to suggest a punishment. Now, here's the problem, is Socrates answers the questions he was asked, and so, what do you deserve for doing this? What, you mean for teaching the youth philosophy? His first answer is housing at the Prytaneum. Why? The Prytaneum was like the equivalent of a 5-star hotel, who people who did a great service to Athens could go for free room and board whenever they felt like it. Olympic athletes and things like that. And Socrates says, well, that person ran fast. I'm obviously doing something much more valuable to the city than doing that. Philosophy, Socrates thinks, is valuable. The unexamined life is not worth living, etc., etc. I'm actually surprised that Socrates even went on after that. But he does say, well, but let's set that aside. So, next, he considers, well, how about exile? And he's like, not really. I'm old, I don't feel like moving. And frankly, since, again, he thinks there's something valuable to philosophy, he's not going to stop, and wherever I move, I'm just going to irritate them too. So he's not going to take exile either, which is a common punishment. And so then he gets to a fine. And how much does he suggest? 1 mina of silver. Or, if you'd like, $35. So, 500 people had just taken days off of work to hear this trial. $35 is not going to do that, not going to accomplish any kind of real punishment. So basically, Plato tugs on his toga and whispers in his ear, and Socrates basically says, hey, since Plato's paying the fine anyway, you could increase that if you want. First of all, that doesn't really seem like a punishment for Socrates, but also remember, there's politics involved too. So Plato's real name is Aristocles, and his dad was quite a mover and a shaker. Right? This is the guy who basically founded a university, the Academy, from his own personal wealth. So the jury are now stuck because, well, we now get to vote on, do we put Socrates to death or do we find Plato's dad? And ultimately, they don't really have a choice here. They have to vote him to death. Now, some people have thought very poorly of Athens. I kind of suspect that if they knew that the verdict was going to lead to Socrates' death, that Socrates wasn't going to give a viable alternative, I think he probably would have been found innocent, uh, especially by so close a margin. Nobody was eager to kill Socrates, as we're going to see a little bit later in the Crito. But unfortunately, that was the law. Socrates didn't help himself there in any capacity. And he even rejected bad reasoning. He said, well, a lot of people bring their wives in to cry and that kind of thing. I'm not going to do that. If I stand on my reasoning and my arguments, and if that doesn't convince you, that's that. So, sentenced to death. And then I mentioned to come prepared with 3 reasons, one of which was an argument for why Socrates did not fear death. We're going to cover those. The brief, kind of philosophically unimportant one, he's like, well, I'm old. I think he was 70 when the apology stuff happened. So he was fairly hardy of constitution, though. He might have lived quite a while longer. But that's a reason, not the most philosophically important. The other 2, though, are quite important. So let's do the argument second. So again, the argument I told you is an either or. It's a deductive argument. And I told you to locate it in the text. And ideally, try to construct it on paper first. Give me the 3 premises and the conclusion. You already know the structure. So if you haven't done so yet, pause the video now and really try it. Like, I'm not kidding. This is good for your education. This is good for success in the course to try to do these things on your own instead of just sitting there playing them out along with Mickey game. Pause. All right. If you've done that, you'll find that the argument is on page 38 if you have your textbook. If not, it is Stephanus 40C. It's the either argument. Let us reflect on it this way, that there is good hope that death is a blessing, for it is one of 2 things. Either the dead are nothing and have no perception, or it is, as we are told, a change in a location from the soul, from here to another place. There you go. It's an either or. Premise. If you want to set it so, if you want to set premise 1 so it's airtight, death is nothing or something. If it is a complete lack of perception, that is, if it's nothing, then death would be a great advantage. For I can think that if one had to pick out of that night during which a man slept soundly and did not dream, put beside it the other nights and days of his life, and then see how many days and nights had been better and more pleasant than that night, not only a private person, but the great king would find them easy to count compared to the other days and nights. Weird way of saying dreamless sleeps are nice. If death is like this, I say it is an advantage, for all eternity would then seem to be no more than a single night. If, on the other hand, let's pause there. So there's the premise 2. Why do we not fear if death is nothing? Because it's akin to a dreamless sleep. That's the premise. If death is nothing, it's akin to a dreamless sleep, which is nothing to fear. But again, if you're explaining arguments instead of just listing, well, I think it's nothing to fear. Well, do you fear going to sleep at night because you might have a dreamless night? No. Much later philosopher David Hume on his deathbed was not afraid and was asked why, and Hume said, I no more fear the time after my death than I fear the time before my birth. There's nothing to fear about a lack of sensation. So, if that would be the reason to accept premise 2. But what if it's something else? If, on the other hand, death is a change from here to another place, we are told is true of all who have died there, what greater blessing could there be, gentlemen of the jury? Roughly speaking, it would be a reunion. So I'm not going to read the rest of that, but that's the general idea, that you get to meet the people who have died already, not just family and friends, but great thinkers and philosophers and statesmen and all sorts of cool people. So, how do we formalize that? Premise 2, premise 3, if death is something, it is some type of reunion ruled over by the just judges, which is nothing to fear. Conclusion, either way, death is nothing to fear. So, let's go ahead and pause and evaluate that. We're going to have to say a little more about premise 3 and the just judges. But first of all, deductive, it's supposed to follow from either or. Does it? Yeah, same as last time. It's the exact same form. And if that form's valid, it's valid for all substitution instances. A or B, if A, then not F. If B, then not F. Conclusion, not F. Or if it were true that there's only two possibilities, and it were true that if it's nothing, there's no reason to fear it, and if it's something, there's no reason to fear it, then yes, it does follow that there's no reason to fear it. No problems there. So, of course it's valid, thanks Father of Western philosophy. Is it sound? Well, what do the sciences tell us about the premises? Again, logic tells us premise 1 is clearly true. I've heard people go both ways about whether premise 2 is a science premise or a philosophical premise. If we're appealing to our own experience, it's probably a science premise, right? So just ask yourself, do you fear dreamless sleep? If the answer is no, you call premise 2 true. If the answer is yes, I'd kind of love to hear why. But usually people find it's the fear of not waking up rather than the dreamless sleep they're afraid of. What about premise 3? Is to say, well, hold on, let's talk about this reunion thing. So an initial reaction is to say, well, wait a minute, Socrates didn't address a negative afterlife, like the Christian hell, for instance. If he just assumes that an afterlife is going to be no fear. There's two things to say about that. One, we try very hard not to accuse philosophers of not having time machines. The notion of that kind of eternal damnation stuff, that even the idea of that didn't exist for another 700 or 800 years. That would be bizarre thoughts to Socrates. And you say, well, wait a minute, don't the ancient Greeks have some of that? So the ancient Greeks had Tantalus and Sisyphus, who both kind of had this eternal damnation thing. But they got that from directly, and I mean directly interacting with directly, pissing off the gods. Sisyphus, for instance, when he was about to die, he told his wife, don't do any of my funeral rites. And so when he died and he got to Hades, and he says, Hades, check this out. My wife didn't do my funeral arrangements. Can I get a little more life to go and punish her accordingly? And of course, then he cheats death for another amount of time. That's what gets you eternal damnation in Greece, not just... It's if you're going to get it, you kind of know. Otherwise, Greek afterlife is just kind of a slightly dark, gothy version of life. So that's thing one is, well, Socrates had no reason to think of that. But here's the more important reason. Remember, Socrates says this is the kind of reunion that would be ruled over by the just judges, i.e. the gods. And so there you have this important notion that, well, if Socrates genuinely believes, first of all, that there are gods and that the gods are moral, and third, that dedicating your life to wisdom and the pursuit of ethics and right living is not the kind of thing that's going to irritate the gods. The gods are not going to punish you for that. So, if you believe those things, i.e. that there are gods, i.e. the just judges, and you believe that... sorry, you don't even have to believe that. If you believe that if there's an afterlife, then there are good gods, that is, just gods, and you believe that Socrates led a good kind of life, he was a very morally upstanding person, then Socrates has given you enough reason to think that that premise is true. At least for himself. Now, for you, who knows? He gave an argument why he shouldn't fear death, but maybe hasn't given an argument that no one should fear death. But that's definitely a philosophical premise in terms of... and notice, even if you're an atheist naturalist who doesn't believe in an afterlife, you could still answer questions like, if there were an afterlife, what would it be like? It's coherent to answer those kind of questions. You could base it on the most probable, or you could say, well, If there's an afterlife, that entails certain higher powers, and if it's a higher power, it's probably not a petulant child and might act in certain ways, etc., etc. In terms of Socrates' moral character, nobody really, other than Melitus, ever had any kind of doubt about that. If you happen to have your textbook and we look at the end of the Phaedo, so the Phaedo is the dialogue where Socrates actually dies. But I just draw your attention to the last line of the Phaedo, page 79, or Stephanus 118a if you have it. Such was the end of our comrade, a man who we would say was, of all the people we have known, the best and also the wisest and most morally upright. So that's what people thought of Socrates. So if that's the kind of life you're living, we would hope you're okay in terms of the just judges. Now, there are people who disagree with that, of course. Dante had Socrates chilling in hell with the unbaptized babies, but Socrates did not believe in that kind of system that he thought would be unjust. So, once more, we should be doing the same thing. Here's a philosophical argument. We know it's valid, which means if we accept all premises, we have to accept the conclusion. How do you feel about premise 2? Do you fear dreamless sleep? If so, why? And do you think that if the afterlife has just judges, that we would have no reason to fear it? Or at least Socrates would have no reason to fear it. So those are great things to write about on the discussion boards. And again, if I ask you to evaluate the argument on the exam, those are the kind of things you have to talk about. If you accept premise 3, then you accept that the argument is sound and must accept the conclusion. If not, Socrates needs more work. But having said that, we could really talk about two different things. Does Socrates convince you that he shouldn't fear the afterlife? Does Socrates convince you that you shouldn't fear the afterlife? Those might actually be different, and pay attention to that. But lastly, and this kind of goes into the just judges thing, there's this third reason that I think it really gets us thinking the right way about ethics. The other reason Socrates doesn't fear death is, roughly speaking, because he thinks he's doing the right thing. The good person, says Socrates, does what they know to be right, regardless of personal consequences. So if I know it's right, I should do it, even if it's going to get me killed. Even though the unexamined life is not worth living is the most famous line of the Apology, my favorite was always the one about wickedness. It is much easier to avoid death than wickedness, for wickedness runs faster. Put another way, we usually know what's right in a situation. The harder thing is actually doing it. We very rarely say, well, I had no idea stealing was wrong. Well, no, it's... but, again, the more important philosophical point Socrates is raising here is... well, maybe Socrates doesn't mention this, but by definition, doing something moral costs you something. Doing what is right costs you something, always. To give a really trivial example, if I pause and politely hold the door open for the person behind me as they're coming in, that costs me something. It costs me a few seconds. If I donate to charity, that costs whatever I'm donating. And so it seems definitional that to go above and beyond and actually do something moral, it costs you something. And Socrates is just embracing that at its most extreme. Well, he's going to do what is right, even if it costs him his life. And if he knows he's doing what is right, he doesn't worry about the consequences. He doesn't fear the consequences, because what we should be doing is what we know to be right. So that is the end of the Apology. I'd love to hear your thoughts again on any of these topics in both the recitation and in the discussion boards. So there's that. Let me set up the next reading. We'll start in Unit 2. So we will have the review period, then the exam. But in Unit 2, we're going to start the Crito. And the Crito just is the next story in the saga of Socrates. Again, this is early Plato, so this is a historical conversation. We know what happened. Roughly speaking, here's the action of the Crito. He's in prison. He languished in prison for a couple days, which is longer than usual because they're not allowed to execute people during a certain religious festival. And so While Socrates is awaiting execution, there's a few more dialogues. The one right after the apology is the Crito. Roughly speaking, Crito walks in, one of those rich followers of Socrates, says, "All right, Socrates, I bribed all the guards. Let's go." And Socrates has the chance to escape prison and therefore execution. But given what we just said, you might imagine Socrates' response is going to be, well, I'm only going to escape if it's the right thing to do. And determining whether it's right or not, there's some very interesting philosophical stuff going on. We're going to talk a little more about the death penalty. But the other thing you should do before you read the Crito, make sure you Google the social contract. The concept, not the book. So Google the social contract. Its first statement, at least that I'm aware of in Western philosophy, is in the Crito, but it's a really, really, really important concept in political philosophy, has some important ramifications nowadays, so we'll also use the Crito to talk some about the social contract. So make sure to do that as well, but again, that's things to be done after exam 1. So before you think about the Crito, you want to make sure you're using your resources for exam 1. So remember the review sheets are online, and remember we have the review period, and I'll go over the format and stuff then. There's also the succeeding in this class document has a special section on succeeding in the exams, so you want to make sure to be checking those out as well, making office hours appointments as needed, etc. Otherwise, we will see you then.